Welcome to Grounded Not Divided, a podcast about leaders who are getting important things done in the real world. I'm Matt Burgess. My guests on this show all have hard-won real-world experiences. Experiences that shed light rather than heat on society's most vital issues. Today's guest is Sharon Friedman. Dr. Friedman worked at the U.S. Forest Service for over 30 years in areas including planning, regulation, litigation, and research. In 2022, she received the Distinguished Alumni Award from the Yale School of the Environment. In her retirement, she founded and has run the Smoky Wire, a popular news and discussion forum for forest and federal lands issues. We discuss what federal scientists do, recent controversies surrounding federal science, federal lands issues in the news today, and how to find common ground. Sharon Friedman, welcome to Grounded Not Divided.
Thanks, Matt. Hey, I really appreciate the work that you do, and I love your podcast.
Yeah, same to you. You know, not just bridge building across divides, across different areas of expertise, but also, you know, the career you've had in the federal government in the civil service feels really important to talk about now, because I think there's a lot of debates going on about the civil service that are to varying degrees detached from what goes on in the civil service. But let's just, before we get into all that, let's talk about your background. Where did you grow up, and how did you get interested in forestry, biology, and the environment?
Well, I grew up in Southern California in the 60s, and Culver City, to be exact, home of Hughes Aircraft and MGM Studios, now Sony at the time. And it was pretty tree-free, natural tree-free environment. And so I went to church camp up in the Angeles National Forest, and I ran into pine trees, beautiful pine trees. And there's a certain species, the Jeffrey pine, that has this wonderful smell on its sun-warmed bark. It's like vanilla or pineapple. And when I first sniffed that tree, I was kind of fell in love with trees. And I sometimes like to think I was a bark beetle in past life, just because those terpenes, they do something for me. So I went into, I was interested in biology. They didn't really have, they didn't have environmental science in those days. And so forestry seemed like a good thing because it seemed like something that you could get a job in. Back in those days, women were usually nurses, teachers, hairdressers, or sisters in my faith community. So to be a forester, to work on the ground, to be outside was an amazing and wonderful thing to be able to do.
That's great. And, it really speaks to how far we've come in, a few decades.
Mm-hmm.
So you worked for the Forest Service for 33 years, right?
Well, I did take time out, and I worked for 1 year also at USDA, United States Department of
Right.
Agriculture. There's another agency that I worked for, which was called at the time the Cooperative State Research Extension and Education Service, but it is now known as the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And what it is it's the USDA part that gives extramural funding to universities, and the land grants has a special relationship with the land grant institutions based on the 1862 Morrill Act, and also the historically Black, Native American, and Hispanic colleges. So through that experience, I was just a couple of years. I did a lot of research administration of federal research grants.
Yeah, and I actually know NEFA well because they gave me the biggest grant my research group has ever had. So I'm very familiar with the extramural lending. Now the Forest Service, you worked on several areas that have been in the news, right? So NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, appeals and litigation, planning, climate change, research and development. You had a stint in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Tell me about the kind of work that you did and how you got interested in planning from your background in genetics.
Well, okay, so back in those days, this was pre-molecular genetics pretty much. We were just on the verge of working with DNA in that way. And so we had when you took breeding, so I had a PhD in genetics and it was an interdisciplinary one. So you had to take like the equivalent of molecular, which was at the time biochemical, quantitative genetics. Quantitative genetics was a big thing. And so that was basically estimating how much breeding would change various traits of like I took dairy cattle breeding, so how much, milk protein, whatever. And really that was quite mathematical. And so the math, it turns out, is much the same as economists use. And
Yep.
economists were then and now big in planning. So when the reforestation business seemed to be drying up, which was my previous work, and I still wanted to stay with the Forest Service. And so let me just put a little aside here. One of the truly great things about a career in the Forest Service, and probably BLM and other federal agencies, is that you don't necessarily have to leave if the work dries up. You can switch to something else. And the something else you switch to can be just as fun or even more fun. Plus, you get to learn about it and get paid for it. So it's just a wonderful career path for those of you considering career paths. Anyway, so yeah, so planning used the same kind of math. And I thought, well, that's more fun than budget. I just don't have budget and planning are two things that agencies and corporations will any or even universities
Right.
probably need to do.
Definitely.
So you're always safe doing one of those things. And so I picked planning of the two. And there were also dual career reasons.
Sure.
I was married to a person who had a degree in mechanical engineering. We were living in Sacramento at the time. I was running a genetics lab there for the Forest Service. And that wasn't a great place for him. But DC was a wonderful place because either of us could lose our jobs and get more jobs based on our technical expertise. So, and then the job opened up in planning in DC, and the rest is history.
So, as I'm sure you know well, one of the challenges and joys of planning is bringing people together who represent different stakeholder groups or have different backgrounds. And that's something that you've done quite a lot of, both in your Forest Service work and outside of it with the Smoky Wire. So
Mhm.
tell me about that. What is the Smoky Wire? What inspired you to set it up, and how does it work?
Okay, well, what we wanted to do was actually it started for students. Um, my idea was that students from all kinds of schools, even schools that aren't close to national forests, could learn a lot about national forests and what great careers there are from having discussions about with people who disagreed about different things. And it turned out that right then, the Obama administration was working on a new planning regulation for National Forest Management Act planning, which is the kind of planning that each forest does. It's sort of the equivalent for BLM has their RMPs, like the Rock Springs RMP in Wyoming attracted much interest and enthusiasm.
And that stands for
Is
Regional Management Plan, is that right?
um, Resource management plan.
Okay, sorry.
So either with BLM or the Forest Service, you have a chunk of land, and either FLIPMA for the BLM, the federal lands, well, I can't remember their legislation, or an NFMA for the Forest Service sort of tells there's statutes that tell the Forest Service or BLM that they need to go ahead and plan. Now, these are from the 70s, these statutes. So you have to recall that back in the 70s, people had this idea that, oh, we'll think about the future and then we'll plan for it and everything will be swell. And of course, as time has gone on and academics have studied planning and all this kind of stuff, people have different ideas now, like, oh, well, maybe, and corporations have tried planning. Well, humans in institutions are much more complex than, oh, this is going to happen and that's going to happen. Take Denver Water, for example. They use scenarios, which makes sense. Okay. What if it gets drier? What if it gets hotter? What if more people move here? What if we can't do this? What if we can do that? Well, that's scenario planning. So people have moved ahead to, well, maybe there's not a fixed future. Maybe the best way to do planning is to look at all kinds of these different things that could happen and pick a strategy that's robust to, the kind of things that could happen. It's sort of a no regret. And nowadays they also have decision making under deep uncertainty. And so, the people that work with water management look at that and we actually don't know. There's so much we don't know. We
And
don't
so
really understand. Oh, sorry.
the
Go
Smoky
ahead.
Wire, it's a blog, right? That brings
Well,
people together to discuss issues around forests.
yes, it's a blog. It's kind of like, I don't know what the difference between a blog and a Substack is, but it definitely started out as a blog.
Substack
And
is just
so,
a type of blog. There are
yeah,
platforms that
okay,
host blogs
okay,
these days that
yeah,
didn't exist probably when you started
right.
that.
Oh, definitely not. Yeah, so it's a blog, and we have different contributors. We've had about six. People fade in and out as they get different kinds of jobs and their interests change. And we try to have contributors that have different points of view, to get discussion going. But we have a really active community of people who respond and people who know things. And probably the most important thing I would say about what we're doing is that more of us, we have our experience and our disciplines. We have lawyers, we have not so much people from academia, but NGO people, Forest Service people. What we are together, what we can learn together is so much more than what each of us brings to the table separately. So it's basically a place where people learn from each other. So on other blogs, you might see people just spout off with something like, I think prescribed fire is makes trees resistant to mountain pine beetle or something. But on our site, somebody I would ask as the person who checks all the comments, I'd say, well, what makes you think that? Do you have personal experience? Is there a paper you could refer to? So, yeah, it's an opportunity for everyone to bring their own experience as well as scientific papers or reports or whatever to the table for us to like jointly puzzle over what the subtleties of the facts might be. And facts are always contingent on temporal and spatial scales. So what might be true in a forest in Montana might be totally different from a forest in South Carolina or even Arizona. So when did you experience it? What were the conditions that you experienced that? And so, one of the things that we're kind of losing if we're not careful, especially with trees, that takes so long. That's the most important. The most unique thing about forest trees is that they take so long to do anything. They take so long to reproduce. But if we're not careful, we'll lose the real world experience of older people who have been working on the land. What was it like then? What were the conditions? Why did you make the choices that you did back in those days? And what were the results? So anyway, that kind of tells you something about the smoky wire.
Yeah, two issues that you raised there that are really important, I think. One is, the history likes to repeat itself, right? So we talk a
Mm-hmm.
lot about, for example, wildfires as being a big issue, particularly in the Western United States. And there's decades of experience in forest management and other things related to wildfires. Another thing that our mutual friend Roger Pilkey Jr. wrote about a few months ago was how the floods in Texas had historical precedent that we could have and probably should have learned from. The second thing that you raised that I think is really important is how a big part of bringing people together who have different perspectives and viewpoints is how you moderate and curate the discussion and how you help draw out the specifics behind people's point of views, because I think that's often where disagreement turns into constructive dialogue. Is like you said, what experience do you have that makes you think that? What's the evidence behind that? And then you can really kind of parse what's underneath. Can you give me a specific example of an issue that you discussed in the Smoky Wire where you thought the discussion went well and where you feel like you learned something or something was learned that helped people understand or deal with this issue better?
Oh, well, it happens. You know what? It kind of happens all the time. But I'd have to say that the legal places are the hardest for non-lawyers. And so when our lawyers chime in about something, oh, even, remember there was this big kerfuffle about, oh, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's something that legislators could use to stop rules that had been, I think, done in the last part of the previous administration. And so there was this whole kerfuffle about, oh, and they were stopping these, or trying to stop, I can't remember exactly how it went, these resource management plans that were extremely unpopular. The reason that they were unpopular is because the governors of the states, who traditionally have been consulted and whose opinions have been honored by the federal government, were kind of blown off. And so, including Wyoming and for Rock Springs. So, so there was all this kerfuffle about, well, if you get rid of these land management plans, every decision that was made under them will go. And so people were saying that. Famous people were saying that. Famous people in the business were saying that. And then so we got some of the law people that are on the Smoky Wire to talk about that and to find out, well, no, that really wouldn't work because it's going to default to the previous one. And those decisions weren't made under that, blah, blah, blah. And it's how complicated it was. It's so absolutely complicated that so I'd have to say that it happens all the time that are that people get a better understanding of why people disagree.
So that's a really good segue, I think, into asking you about NEPA. So NEPA stands
Hmm.
for the National Environmental Policy Act, I believe, and it's maybe, the central villain in the discourse that I've seen around the idea of permitting reform broadly, that we need to get permits done faster, depending on who you're talking to, for renewable energy projects, for fossil fuel projects, for transmission projects, for all of those things. And permits for these things can take, 10 years or more. So what is NEPA and what role does it play in permitting?
Okay, well, NEPA, so that's for federal permitting. So there has to be a
Yeah.
federal nexus. And so the point of NEPA originally was to make sure that before, I mean, I can't remember, 1970. The point was to consider environmental factors when you're making a federal government decision. I mean, today that seems like, well, duh. But back in the day, it was worthy of creating a law to do that. But some of the discussion you'll run into is that it's intended to be a procedural statute. So I kind of call them the permitting bros, permitting reform bros. And there's a bunch of young, mostly guys, in think tanks in DC, and this is new territory for them. And so they'll basically say that, well, we have good enough non-procedural statutes like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. So why don't we put more emphasis on those and less emphasis on NEPA, which is just sort of supposed to expose what the environmental trade-offs are. But because it's procedural, it's become a sort of a hive, well, a home for a lot of litigation from people who don't want that particular project.
Right.
So, and there's all kinds of procedural things that you can bring up. Like the poor BLM, I feel really sorry for them.
And just to be
Um,
clear, because that acronym is has a couple of different
oh, sorry,
meanings,
Bureau of
Bureau of
Land
Land
Management.
Management is what you're talking
Right.
about.
So we were doing something, I think like a coal mine EIS or something like that. And the judge said, well, you're supposed to examine the climate change impacts and we don't like the way that you examine the climate change impacts. Well, the some of these projects, or some of the times the litigation was going on for so long that the where the coal was actually going to go was different. The prices were different. You can appreciate that as an economist.
Sure.
For 7 years, if something goes on for 7 years, all the things that you calculated at the beginning are probably not going to be true anymore. But the whole idea that this one particular coal mine in Wyoming or wherever it was going to have an impact on the that it would have specific impacts to the world that could be traced was kind of silly. So our idea as NEPA people at the time was, why doesn't the government just come up with something that for 40 grams of CO2, you get this? And then all the different agencies could use the same thing and wouldn't have to come up with it on their own and then be litigated about it. But anyway, so that was kind of an
And
aside.
is that related to the Obama administration and then later the Biden administration, and I think also Trump one, having a social cost of carbon that was used
Oh,
by the EPA in their cost benefit analysis?
well, that's kind of related, but it's a totally bogus number. And I can't tell you how psychologically tough what it is for people to have to go in and calculate bogus numbers that they know is bogus. They know
Yeah.
are bogus. I'm not sure the lawyers really know that they're bogus. I don't know that the judge knows that they're bogus because they're not involved in calculating them, if you see. Anyway, the point is not that NEPA is a bad thing to do. People are really good at NEPA. But for some reason, the focus tends to be so there are people that in the past there are groups that have this strategy of litigation. If you go back to the timber wars in Oregon and Washington in the 70s, it was an intentional way of getting what they wanted was to litigate. And so it's hard to crack that because the people basically they have the levers. And so the agencies have to get more and more and more sophisticated at thinking up what strategies the litigants that don't want the project are going to come up with. And so that's when NEPA gets a bad name, in my opinion.
And so the just to flesh this out for those who are less expert than you are you describing kind of a process where basically the folks who work at NEPA to try to anticipate the sorts of
Hmm.
litigation you might get end up having to put together longer and longer review
Hmm.
documents that then become more and more time consuming, which in a way helps the folks who want to stop the project. It's kind of like the process is the punishment, uh, would be the saying, right?
Well, so speaking as a former NEPA person, um, we know how to streamline. We know, you know, if 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 groups aren't lurking around, not lurking, that's kind of pejorative. If groups aren't around that folks know will be litigating that particular project, then if there aren't groups around that are likely to litigate, NEPA practitioners can just zoom through it and the decision maker can consider all these things and make the decision. So NEPA itself isn't really the problem in my view. Although, yes, like any project that happens, certainly there are efficiencies to be made, and good management makes it go smoother, and so on and so forth. But the Forest Service has been the target of probably more litigation than any other agency. And so many times there's been studies about how to improve it. And basically we know how to improve it. But I think the best thing, so one of these tech permitting reform bros suggested to me, well, I think a permitting dashboard would be a really good thing.
Don't they
And I
have
thought,
one?
well, states have that.
Okay.
And fast 40 projects have that. That's a certain federal kind of project that's supposed to be faster. So they have it. And at first I thought, well, no, what help is that going to do? But then I thought, well, if everybody could see that,
Yeah.
if it was public facing and and it went through litigation. See, that's the thing, is most of these databases stop when the project is approved.
Right.
But that's not the holdup for a lot of projects. It's litigation. And so we can't see, a lot of those litigation documents aren't even free to the public. So if we could see those timelines, if we could see the settlement, I think everybody would be operating from, oh, yeah, we can analyze this whole process and see where the holdups really are. But anyway, but my basic point is it isn't NEPA the statute, it's not NEPA the regulations. It's that holds things up as much as it is. Now there can be, of course, like I was saying, in any project that you get involved with, especially agencies, maybe you're consulting with Fish and Wildlife Service for some Endangered Species Act thing, and they don't have anybody that you're working in that or whatever. So anything the agencies or universities do, any projects can always be managed better. But there's management issues and then there's litigation issues. And I don't think litigation issues have necessarily received the attention that they could.
So let me zero in on that. Is there, and with the caveat that I understand that you're not a lawyer, and so
Right.
you're welcome to plead the fifth if you like. But there's a lot of energy in policymaking now around quote unquote permitting reform.
Mhm.
One of our senators from Wyoming, Senator Barrasso, is involved in this with Senator Manchin from West Virginia. Suppose that they came to you and said, Sharon, what should we put in our bill that would make this litigation problem less of a problem? What would you tell them?
Well, first of all, there's just okay. So there's ideas that might seem like really normal to you or I that are really unpopular with certain elements in the Democratic group for reasons that aren't particularly clear to me. One of them is timelines for litigation. So right now, I don't know, it's 6 years or something in some cases. So I think there was a thing to do 120 days. And so that seems like something that would be great. Just get it over with faster. But see, you kind of run into a separation of powers problem because judges don't like to be told what to do. I can safely say that. And if the Congress tells them what to do, they might say, well, you're just the Congress. We don't necessarily um, have to, they have a lot of latitude. So I think that has to be really sensitive because Congress can tell them, um, oh, you need to consider this and not consider that. They've had things like that, especially when it comes to preliminary injunctions. You need to consider this and not consider that. Um, so anyway, well, so that was kind of pointless. Sorry.
No, no,
Um,
it's okay. So you're talking
but
about timelines. The question was what advice would you give to Senators
right.
Barrasso and
So
Manchin?
yeah, no, I'd go with 120 days to just get it over. Litigation is fine. It's a voice of the people and all that. Get it over faster. Then I'd say when it comes time for settlements, make those settlement discussions open to the public because here's these people and the public, and they've been making all of these comments on this project. And when it goes into litigation, and if DOJ is Department of Justice, they're uh, rated on settling cases, so they want to settle cases. And yet their settlement, might not really be the best for different kinds of people. So, but it's all secret. And the people who were actually reading the public comment are usually not in the settlement. It's the lawyers. So I think that would be a great thing, is if these lawsuits are settled, to just have the settlement be open to public comment.
Oh,
Um,
that's a fascinating idea.
yeah. In fact, Colorado Springs, I think, they wanted to do that about some settlements for, I don't know, some kind of things going on with the city. Maybe HR, human, maybe employment kinds of issues. But they wanted to know basically and where the money's going too. I think that they were more interested in the financial aspects of the settlement.
I want to
So
ask you
that would,
about a
oh, go
couple of
ahead.
other, no, no worries. I want to ask you about a couple of other areas related to public lands that have been in the news a lot lately.
Hmm.
The first is expanding the use of public lands for mining, for minerals such as rare earths, for energy production, or for both of those things. Is this
Hmm.
something that you think the government should be doing? And if so, how should they be going about deciding where and how to do it?
Okay. Well, I had a very wise lands and minerals director that I worked with named Randy Karstad. And his view was that minerals are where they are. So we think about a lot of things like recreation. You could do it here or you could do it there. Timber, you could do it here, you could do it there. But minerals, we only have them in certain places.
Right.
So you kind of have to work from that. So then the question is, well, if if minerals were equally distributed on private or public land, where should you go first? Or, what kind of mix should you do? Okay, so then there's different ways of looking at that. And this is a very NEPA-ish way of looking at it. So take oil and gas. So you have the Permian and you have all that private land. Well, it's easier for companies to get things done, no two ways about it on private, just because of federal permitting procedures. Should it be? I don't know. Um, but it is. So then you could look at, well, are the environmental, if we got, so many CCF of natural gas from Wyoming over here versus New Mexico over there, are there different environmental impacts? And should we pick one over the other based on the environmental impacts? Well, you'd have to kind of think about those and balance them. Then the other thing you could think is economic impacts. Hmm, so take some X area in Wyoming and Y area in New Mexico. Um, well, if it's federal, the feds get to keep some of the money and give it to the state. New Mexico makes all kinds of money off the federal oil and gas estate. So that goes to the state, and that's really good. But on the other hand, if it's private, how does the money flow? Is there more money? Do private people, and I'm not sure we even know this. Um, does the money that comes from the companies, where does it go? Spatially, does it stay in the community more if it's on a if the wells are on private land? Or does it not make any difference in terms of which communities get how much money and whether is it a good thing for the federal government to get the money versus wherever it goes? If it's not the federal government as a landowner or the private people as a landowner, I mean, there's all kinds of questions about that too. But the fact, the legal background is that those lands are legally intended to be multiple use lands and for whatever the country needs most.
And so
And
it's
so,
absolutely administration's prerogative to decide what that is? Is that the law basically?
Um, mm, it's yes, I'd say some kind of combination of the three, the Congress, the president, and the courts, some kind of combination of that. Because if the president wanted to do something that wasn't in FLIPMA, the BLM's act, they couldn't. But
Gotcha.
yeah, certainly going. I mean, and then there was the 1872 Mining Act. So that has to do with encouraging mining. Now, people have wanted to fix that up and make it more relevant to today, but they haven't yet. So there's a but right now the basic idea of federal lands is that if you need them, you should be using them for stuff, you know. And so
Yeah.
that's what makes BLM and Forest Service, there are two multiple use federal agencies, but the law is for multiple use. But that's really hard, right? Who
Yeah.
decides, is this only source of lithium more important than the say the Thacker Pass, than that particular buckwheat or whatever the plant is how much will the oil and gas development impact like recreation or species?
The
So
Pebble
that's
Mine
what,
is an example that I think that comes to mind in this with in Alaska where
right.
copper, I believe it was, is a really important source of copper, potentially a threat to a salmon fishery. And somebody I know who worked in the first Trump administration said that people didn't want to talk about that issue because it was an issue that kind of divided their base. If you think about fishers, miners, both traditionally Republican leaning groups. Okay, another issue I want to ask you about is selling public land. So there was a
Mhm.
proposal, I believe, in June as part of the negotiations around the One Big Beautiful Bill to to sell off some public lands for the perspective of the budget. The canon in
Mhm.
macroeconomics says that if you sell a federal asset, you're affecting the budget balance in the next year, but in the long run, if you price it properly, you're not because you're basically forfeiting a stream of revenues that if you've priced it, in a revenue maximizing way, will exactly offset the benefit of selling it that you get today. This proposal, as I recall, mobilized really strong opposition both among Democrats and
Mhm.
among some Republican groups,
Mhm.
including some Republican environmental groups. What's your take on this? Is there any circumstance under which you think the federal government should consider selling public lands? And if so, what is that context?
Well, my BLM friends say that they already have that capability when it's important for housing or whatever for
Sure.
a landlocked community. The most obvious example is Las Vegas. I guess there was under when Henry Reid was senator,
Harry
there
Reid,
was
yep.
yeah, Harry Reid, sorry. There was a bill to do that. So they did that. So my BLM friends say, retiree friends say that the potential already exists when it's needed to sell it. And so don't mess with it. I think the Forest Service might be a little more opaque, but the thing is, that dog is not going to hunt. It was never going to hunt. And I don't know why Mike Lee or whoever it was brought it up, because all it is, people don't want to lose their land. Even and they're talking about some stuff in some building some housing in Jackson, I think. And I think they're talking about leasing it for housing. So there's that too. If you really need the land, you don't have to sell it. You can lease it.
Now, can you explain a question about I have about that? So if Jackson, the city of Jackson, say leases a patch of federal land, builds housing on it, and I buy a house in that piece of land,
Hmm.
is does my property right over the house I just bought, is it affected potentially by that lease?
Yeah, no, it's a lease. Yeah, I would think so. I mean, just think about it. We already have permitted like lodges and uh, uh, like YMCA camps and all that other kind of stuff is permitted on federal land.
Because that seems like it creates a really interesting wrinkle in the housing market there that you sort of have somewhat of an insecure property right. There's a somewhat related controversy going on in Canada right now in British Columbia, where a court has decided that a chunk of the town of Richmond, which is a suburb of Vancouver, actually belongs to an indigenous tribe. And so there's a bunch of people who own homes on that plot of land who now don't know, and their banks are telling them that their banks don't know uh, if they own their house anymore, which is kind of a, yeah, as you can imagine,
Well,
very,
the
very controversial situation.
I've followed the one in Summit County more, down here in Summit County, Colorado,
Yeah, tell
and
me about that one. I'm not familiar.
I think it's the same. There's a news story today about Jackson, and then about this one too. I think the idea is that those are rentals, though.
I see. I see rental properties.
Yeah, and so conceivably, if it came to the end, they would just go and they'd destroy it or whatever. I just think, there's some public policy things that people, if you have a 95-year lease or whatever they're talking about, things are going to change so much in 95 years
Right.
that,
You're more, it's
I mean,
beyond the scope of your mortgage. Your bank's not going to care.
right,
Yeah,
right,
that makes
right.
sense. So one more issue that's been in the news a lot that I want to ask you that's more specific to the Forest Service is wildfires. So
Hmm.
there have been some devastating wildfires, including the one in the Los Angeles area about a year ago, the Palisades fire. Uh, there is, as far as I understand, a pretty clear connection to climate change in terms of wildfire risk, particularly in the Western United States. However, there are also many, many, many things that contribute, some would argue, quite a lot more to wildfire risks than climate change that we don't as often hear about in the news. And so I'd love to hear your take on what are things that we could be doing as a society to reduce the risk of these sorts of catastrophic wildfires, particularly in the West.
Well, I think we pretty much know what we need to do.
You do, but our
The,
listeners don't. So
oh,
what are
okay,
what are those
sorry.
things?
So I think there's basically, we've been sort of fighting about this thing for a long time. Fuel treatments. Okay, so there's two reasons to do fuel treatments and woody vegetation. Let's just talk about woody vegetation now. Because of fire suppression, mostly. A lot of species have grown in over the last 100 years, and in dry areas, that makes them, since there's more trees there, they didn't burn up, they're sucking a lot of water, they dry out, and then they get susceptible to bugs like pine beetles and things like that. So the thing is to thin them out, and that makes them healthier and more resilient, and also reduce what we call ladder fuels, which are smaller trees. So the fire starts on the ground and it gets in the smaller trees, it gets in the crowns, kills all the trees. That's bad. So we know how to do that. We thin trees and we get rid of ladder fuels. And that's good, but you can't afford to do that everywhere. So people have come up with this idea of potential operational delineations or pods. And those are areas where you work with fire suppression people and fuels people to figure out where are the best holding lines, to put in your firefighting forces, depending on, standard wind directions and the topography and all these other kinds of variables. So what they're doing nowadays is kind of mapping out these things in advance and treating them with thinning and prescribed burning. So prescribed burning is like under burning. That's a good way to think about it. In most cases, it's reducing the fine fuels by running a fire underneath the trees. So, we kind of know how to do that, but it's going to take a lot of money. And so timber industry could pay for some of it, but timber industry is gone from a large part of especially Intermountain West. And so that makes it kind of tough. So anyway, it takes a lot of funding. The poor people in Arizona, they have a biomass plant, but it can't take all the stuff they need to get rid of, all the woody material they need to get rid of. So it's been woody utilization of this waste material from these thinnings has been a problem for, 50 years or so, and hopefully some people will figure it out. We know how to do that. We know how to do prescribed burning. Um, Basically, oh, and then there's protecting communities. So we know how to do that. People aren't doing as well as they could about home hardening and developing evacuation routes and things like that. It's not that we don't know what to do. It's that people aren't necessarily doing it. Um, and that's kind of another problem. Does that make sense?
It totally does. So, two follow-up questions. One regarding funding. What are your thoughts on first the proposal in the Make America Beautiful Again executive orders to have higher park fees for foreign tourists? Help pay for some of this stuff? And second of all, what do you think about the incentives and the prospects of power utilities paying for some of this stuff, given that in some places, like in California, they're now having to shut down, do blackouts preventatively to avoid fires and then some of the enormous liability risk they can have.
Well, let me take the second one first, and then you can remind me about the first one. I see a problem here in the West, especially windy areas like Laramie or where I live. When you're trying to electrify everything, and then you turn off the electricity to protect from wildfires, that's like difficult to put together those two puzzle pieces. So I think that, yes, uh, power companies should probably bury their cables, but right now, sorry, not cables, power
Their lines.
transmission, their lines. But right now, they're being sued for humongous amounts of money, especially in California and Oregon. And so, how are they? And they're supposed to build out all this new infrastructure for renewable energy standards, say in Colorado. So, I mean, I have to kind of feel sorry for them. Like, where's this money going to come from?
Do you
Um,
think how would it so that burying their power lines underground, how would the cost of that do you think compare to the cost of them paying for prescribed burns to reduce fuel in the areas where their lines run?
they're already doing that, as far as I know. Not maybe it's prescribed burning, but they're doing a lot of vegetation maintenance. Um, but they have to maintain their lines, so that like ones that, uh, arc to the ground. I mean, it's a difficult problem, and it's going to cost a lot of money no matter what they do. But yeah, they are doing a lot of maintenance. Um,
Yeah, so the other idea that I wanted to ask you about was uh, this idea which I believe is in one or both of the Make America Beautiful Again executive orders that President Trump signed a few months ago. And
mhm.
and basically the idea is we're going to charge higher fees to visit national parks to foreign tourists and tourists specifically because I checked, as somebody who has a green card, I checked carefully to see that it would not apply to me. But specifically, we're talking about foreign tourists who come to visit national parks. We're going to increase their park fees pretty significantly, and we're going to use that money to do some of this forest maintenance that we're behind on. What's your take on that?
Oh, I'm not sure because those are parks. The money's going to parks. And so I think that mostly what they're considering is all the other kinds of maintenance that national parks
Gotcha.
need. Yeah. And, that's really an economic question. Um, well, I don't see any problem. What would you go by? What is wrong with charging other people who don't pay for? Oh, yeah. I actually wrote about this, come to think of it. If I go to California from Colorado and they have a beautiful state park and I want to use it, and I'm not a taxpayer in Colorado, I mean, in California, I don't mind paying extra because I'm not a taxpayer, you know?
Yeah, I agree
So
actually.
I don't see and if I go to another country, well, California's not another country, but if I went to another country, I wouldn't mind paying more. And when you think about all the money that these foreign tourists spend, $100, really?
Right, to get here in the first place. No, I completely agree. I think it's a very sensible proposal.
And I think the National Park Service even did like a willingness to pay. I'm not a big fan of willingness to pay, but a willingness to pay thing for views of wolves or something, and it was like $10,000. I don't know if you've seen that study.
I haven't. It's pretty hard to find wolves. I was thinking I've been to Yellowstone. I've never,
Right.
and there's tons of them, and I haven't seen one. But
Well,
yeah, I
and
mean, it's
that's
cool.
I don't know exactly but I think they came up with $10,000. So now how much it should be, that's another question, because some people have said, well, $100 is too much. I don't know. I don't know how much it should be, but I don't think the idea of charging people differently and then having to show your driver's license. Shoot, how often do I have to show my driver's license to go to the doctor. So I don't really, and I actually have to show it at national parks now because I have an old person pass, and the old person pass requires you showing that pass and your driver's license. So yeah, I'm not too wound up about it personally. And I don't know understand why people actually care that much because it's a new source of income not coming from us. So,
To be fair,
I
I
mean,
haven't seen, I'm sure there's some people who oppose it, but I haven't seen, super animated opposition. So
yeah, no.
two more questions that I want to
Sorry.
ask. The first is related to something else that's been in the news around the civil service, and that is indirectly the Hatch Act. And where it comes up in the news is, that there was a big push to, trim the ranks of the civil service in last
Mm-hmm.
spring, under the
Mm-hmm.
Doge effort. There's a general gripe in areas that I think includes it's fair to say, environmental policy among people on the right and in the center that the civil service has been or can be politicized. And yet there's also this thing called the Hatch Act, which I'm sure you're familiar about, and I'm going to ask you to explain
Mm-hmm.
it to our listeners. Um, so let's start there. Tell me about the Hatch Act and how it constrains civil servants from being politicized. I think in many of the ways that some people worry that they are.
Well, I don't know that it's a Hatch Act thing. Okay, so the Hatch Act, now it's been a while, but my understanding is you're not supposed to if you're a civil servant, you're not supposed to get involved in partisan activities. And some
Yeah.
partisan activities are okay and other ones aren't. And I was never interested in partisan activities, so I never uh, I never really dug into it. I think what people, right and center people are concerned about is that many people in the civil service have mm, Democrat, let's just say Democratic I think
Uh,
Democratic sort of point of view,
yeah, have a left of
and
center
that
worldview.
right, left of center worldview. And they actively, I don't think they worry so much about them aiding and abetting enthusiastically Democratic administrations as much they worry about them um, providing obstacles and to a Republican administration by their work, not so much what they do offline.
Is there someone I know who works in business? It's a slightly different context, but he's thinking about trying to anticipate how regulations and rules are going to change or not changes from one administration to the next. And he described to me the idea that there's, you know, the political appointees have an attention span and kind of an ability to micromanage that only goes so deep, and the civil
Hmm.
service takes over kind of underneath that. And so the concern would it be fair to say that the concern among folks in the center and in the right is that basically the apparatus underneath that level of attention from political appointees is always going to steer rulemaking and decision making in a more left democratic direction. Is that fair as a characterization of the issue?
It is, but I look at more as sort of co-evolution. So if say something is not say the civil servants feel that something might not be the best idea. Um, there was an old growth effort. So let's pick the last administration, even though it was Democrats. I think there was a general feeling among career Forest Service people that this old growth initiative was pretty much an enviro group kind of thing and might not be all that useful because it was about drawing lines around old growth and not leaving it alone instead of, working to make it more fireproof. And so you can slow walk things. Agencies can slow walk things in a variety of ways. They have techniques perfected through generations of civil servants to slow walk things. And so that can work for either. And I think actually a lot of people, and it varies, it certainly varies by agency. So I think that's a really important thing to point out to any of your listeners who are involved in thinking about this, that the EPA is not the Forest Service, is not DOE.
Is not NOAA.
I'm
I mean,
right.
one of the things that I've experienced, before coming to Wyoming, I was in an institute at University of Colorado Boulder that's joint with NOAA, the series.
Mhm.
And, as somebody who's been at times annoyed with and called out publicly politicization in academia and in climate change research, it's always struck me that the NOAA federal employees are the by far the least politicized people in the climate space, at least in my experience. And so it
Right,
sort of felt like
right.
the wrong target to me.
It's very location specific. And it can even be group specific. But yeah, there's a lot of internal things that can go on. So the centrist groups would say, the centrist sort of agencies would say, hey, we prevent our stonewalling or slow walking or whatever it is, techniques protect from bad ideas on both sides. And I certainly think that that's true.
So to
So,
what
so
extent and I can understand how extrapolating that if you had a part of the civil service that was very one side or the other, that it wouldn't be the case that it would be kind of checking bad ideas on both sides as much as it would be kind of helping one side and obstructing the other side.
Oh,
So let me ask you, just as from a solutions perspective, what if anything should be done about this? And I ask, from just showing my hand that the federal civil service is something like 4% of the federal budget. So, someone who's studied the federal budget a little bit, I can say with pretty high confidence that federal civil service is not where you're going to balance the budget. uh, but let's say that there are areas where this political lean, slow walking thing is an issue. Uh, what can we do about it?
well, that's really a good question. I think one thing I've noticed myself, because I worked in both administrations, that there's sort of a leaking to media pathway that seems to occur more in D administration or more in our administrations and D administrations. So I would think imposing one set of sort of rules, because in my experience, again, media tends to be on one side.
Yeah.
And so we'd have people leak stuff about what we were doing and the media would post it. So one thing would be to say, nobody, it's bad to leak stuff, even if you agree with it. But I do think there's true believers in the civil service. And to a true believer, there aren't, I don't think there's most of them because most of the true believers are political appointees. But the true believers believe that the ends justify the means. And so trying to, maybe crack down on those people, or crack down on specific
When they
bad
break the
things
rules.
that people
Yeah.
do, right, when they break the rules. I've reported on the Smoky Wire on a particular thing that I thought the media would be interested in during the Biden administration, and no one was interested in reporting on it. That I got from a whistleblower. So
Do you think
there,
that the
there's,
opening up of the media landscape is fixing that a little bit? Like, I've certainly noticed with some of the issues in higher ed that, could probably have been bigger media stories 5 years ago, that the
mhm,
expansion of new media and also just public consciousness changing has changed the landscape a little bit where, I mean, for example, the New York Times published a year or two ago, a really long piece on how the University of Michigan had wasted billions of, make sure I'm not misquoting, hundreds of millions of dollars, I think, on DEI
mhm.
initiatives that didn't have a measurable impact. Uh, and certainly there's lots of things in other new media. Do you think that the story that you wanted to place back then would get traction now?
No. So here's the thing for our world. Okay, so we know we have sort of what we might call right-wing media and left-wing media. And so people would think, well, that's easy. You just go, if there's left-wing media won't publish it, you go to right-wing media. Well, right-wing media doesn't care about our stuff. So it's kind of a gap. So, and because I tried that, and with this particular story, it was about funneling money for a mastication a field treatment project in Arizona through this NGO, the Southern Baptist, or no, it wasn't Southern Baptist, National Baptist Convention out of Louisiana. And like, why send the money to those people and have them rake all this money? And there were other kinds of questionable people involved. But yeah, no, I sent it to other people, other media, and they just didn't care. So, which is kind of off the subject. I do think that you talking about and them talking, employees talking about what's okay, because that's our worldview, and what's not okay to do is uh, is really important because culturally people can, I've been in situations where people just stand around on government time complaining about Republicans. So, that's just not good workforce behavior,
That's right.
particularly.
It's not.
It wouldn't be good complaining about Democrats either. And I do think there's something interesting about the media, the not the media, but the new social media kinds of things, is that people feel that they are federal employees feel that they should like spout off their personal opinions about things all the time. And that's okay. I mean, it's a free country and all that. But if you are a federal employee and you're going on and on about how Republicans are bad, then Republicans are going to get the idea on your social media. Republicans are going to get the idea that you don't support, well, they wonder about your loyalties to the Constitution versus your loyalty to your party. And the Constitution says that that's an elected president, and you are voluntarily working for the executive branch.
Right.
So ethically, I mean, I'm not a big person to bring up ethics because I think people tend to use it when they don't have a rational argument. But, you know, it's when you do that, yes, you can say whatever you want. But when you do that, you make your organization look bad to other people. That's just you can't stop that from happening. And it's the same thing with professors.
Totally.
I'm sure there are professors at some schools that engage in behave, saying things that are that are bad. And the university administration has to decide, well, yeah, they can say whatever they want, but boy, it makes us look like a bunch of jerks. So like, what's the line here?
Now, professors and civil servants, actually, there's an interesting difference in this area, certainly with respect to the law and also with respect to practice. So there's at least one famous court case. I think Garcetti uh, was the defendant in it. I can't remember the plaintiff, but basically, there are circumstances, legal question of when can the government fire you from government employment for your extramural speech. There actually are some circumstances
Hmm.
where civil servants can be fired for extramural speech when it's deemed to affect the functioning of the organization substantially in some way. That may not be
Hmm.
exactly the right legalese, but that's the gist of it. Um, However, the court decisions have often said that academics have a special category of freedom within that because to some extent it is our job to spout off, right? But just to spout
Right.
off with integrity and high levels of evidentiary standards about things that we're studying and are expert in, right? And certainly the line can get blurry between uh, you know, like if I say something about economics, right, that some government official doesn't like, right? I'm
Hmm.
100% within my academic
Right.
freedom there. If I say on my own time on my Facebook, something about some unrelated issue, again, I'm protected by the First Amendment as somebody exercising my speech rights clearly as a private citizen. But certainly, there are a lot of areas where I think it gets pretty gray in academia. If you're, for example, from there's something that made minor news yesterday, where a professor from my previous university in Colorado, who runs a humanities center, sent out an email uh, to her center saying basically that the current U.S. government is fascist and authoritarian, and that she was prompted to say so by the removal of Venezuela's dictator, which is there's some irony maybe there, because there's no mention in the statement about the Maduro being a dictator, uh, but the University of Colorado has now a statement neutrality policy that says that officers of the university in their capacity as officers of the university are not supposed to make statements about political views. And so she had to issue this kind of partial retraction correction, just saying I'm saying it as myself and not as the director of the center. Um, but this statement and others that I've seen like it did explicitly try to claim expertise, right? It wasn't just saying, I don't like the administration, I think it's fascist. It was, in my expertise as a humanist who studies history, which in this case is maybe a little bit of a stretch as an English professor. I know that this person is a fascist, right? And you've seen other kinds of things, statements from other academics there, and that seems like again, as far as I understand the law, it is and should be protected. But it's an interesting bending, some would argue maybe corruption of our trusted role as experts to kind of, basically be dishonest about when you're wearing your expert hat and when you're wearing your private citizen with an opinion hat.
Well, so as a person who went to school, I went to school twice. Once in the 70s. I did my postdoc in the 80s. And then came back and got a certificate from Iliff School of Theology in what the 2000s, 2010s. Um, so what strikes me about that story is, don't people have enough work to do? I mean, does she really think what are you trying to what are you trying to do by sending an email spouting your opinions? Really?
It reminds me, there's
Um,
another story of when I was down there. This is a much bigger controversy in the campus. We had, it happened to be the case that during the year when January 6th happened, that in Colorado were hosting John Eastman on sabbatical. Uh, and he
mhm.
was, the chief
Oh, I
architect
remember that
maybe of this.
experiment. Right,
Yeah, yeah,
right.
yeah. So obviously when the January 6th rally happened, that was a big controversy that, he was on sabbatical at our university. But before that, there was he had written. So I'm not a expert in this area of law, but I gather that he's been writing for decades that the courts have never actually decided if children who are born in the United States to parents who are on non-immigrant visas, if they have natural citizenship rights. Now, full disclosure, that's the exact situation that applies to both of my children. So I hope he's wrong. Uh,
Hmm.
but
Right,
the situation also applies to Kamala Harris, and and so when she was nominated for VP, he wrote an op-ed saying actually he doesn't think that the courts decided that she's a citizen. And of course, he's going to write that op-ed regardless of who she is, what party she is,
right.
what color her skin is. This is his pet theory that he's been peddling for decades. And this test case has now come up in this very, very prominent way. But as you can imagine, that op-ed um, motivated angry responses, charges of racism from people on campus. And I remember our dean at the time writing a statement basically saying, while I disagree with his view, I support his freedom to express it. And I remember thinking, dude, you're a chemist. Like nobody cares what you think about this law area of law. Like just say that you support his freedom or say nothing. you know.
Right,
Uh,
right, right. And that's a really interesting question. I don't know if social media bred this idea that people need to state their opinions about everything. I don't know.
Yeah,
I-
I think it did in terms of like individuals spouting off, or maybe it just gave people who always wanted to spout off a way to spout off.
right.
I think it created, echo chambers, which made it such that people, I think, often don't realize the negative reactions that they're getting quietly from people that are not in their bubble, and so I think they don't. Some people don't appreciate kind of what they're maybe doing to their own reputations unintentionally. And then, pressure for administrators to talk about everything. That's a more complicated history
Okay.
of sociology that comes partly from pressure from students. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianov write some good stuff about this, or interesting, informative stuff about this in their book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Anyway, it's short answer is it's complicated. Before we run out of time, I do want to ask you my one
But
last
yeah,
question. Yeah,
let
go
me
ahead.
just say one thing. One of the things about the smoky wire is that people can share their ideas because we have a spirit that even there might be some of us who have political power, but most of us don't. So by sharing our opinions, we are just stating what we think based on specific, either our experience or studies or whatever. And I think that maybe that tendency, maybe that's a certain thing of, I don't know, humility, that maybe nobody
Yeah.
really cares about it doesn't matter if Susan, Jane, and I disagree about which particular uh, diameter limit a sale in California should have, because neither of us are going to be, well, maybe she would, but I mean, I just think there's something about that too.
Perceived
Um,
stakes for sure. Yep.
yeah, and also the fact that and you can't say mean things at all. I mean, I'm just not going to allow mean things.
Yeah, I mean, I
And I
think
think it shades into like fascism. Ooh, it's fascist. Well, that's not very, what are we going to have a big discussion? The other thing about these kind of things, like you're mentioning, is that they're sort of drive-bys, right? that person doesn't want to engage in a meaningful discussion that could take them days over the history of the concept of fascism,
Right.
what things could be fascist, and then do different disciplines disagree? Do historians feel differently than political scientists? Which ones feel differently and why? People don't want to engage in that. They're
Well,
just
and is there
like,
an irony that, you're spouting off freely about this, which you can't do in a fascist regime, right? And people, critics of Maduro are actively being jailed, for celebrating his capture in Venezuela. Okay, I do want to
yeah,
ask you,
that's true. Yeah,
do want to ask you this
but
one last question.
the
Sorry, go
point,
ahead.
yeah, no, the point is that they don't really want to engage in dialogue, and you can feel it.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's relates to kind of purity psychology as far as I know, and
Yeah,
tribalism as far as I
yeah,
understand it. But okay,
yeah.
my last question is it's inspired by Konstantin Kissin's podcast, which I think is often really interesting. He always ends by asking his guests, "What's something we're not talking about that we should be?" So, what would be your answer to that?
Oh, I would definitely say litigation. We're not. So the thing is that people don't want a project litigate, and that's going to happen. Um, and really, it's always got to be a political answer as to it's citing things that people don't want in their neighborhood, be it uranium mines or wind turbine farms or transmission lines. Somebody's ox is always going to get gored. And so we need to be honest. We need to say, look, somebody's ox is going to get gored, and how do we do this in the fairest way possible? And it's not necessarily by a litigation settlement. I don't know what the answer is, but I think if we were more honest about what this was about, we could come to better solutions.
Well, that's a really important note to end on. Sharon Friedman, thank you very much for coming on Grounded Not Divided, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Grounded Not Divided. If you want to hear more episodes like this, be sure to subscribe for free on Apple, Spotify, or on the Guided Civic Revival Substack. You can also email us feedback at matt.burgess@uwyo.edu. See you next time.